Jimmy Fallon has hosted some of the biggest names in entertainment history. Presidents, Oscar winners, rock legends. But there's one group that visibly shifts his energy every single time they walk through that door. BTS has appeared on The Tonight Show multiple times since 2019, performing on the famous outdoor stage at Rockefeller Center, taking over the entire plaza, selling it out in minutes. Fallon has gone on record calling those moments some of the most electric in the show's modern era. He didn't just interview them, he played with them, laughed with them, and clearly studied them. So here's the question nobody's really asked out loud. If Jimmy Fallon had to rank the 7 members of BTS, not by talent, not by chart performance, but by the kind of raw, magnetic presence that makes a talk show host forget he's working, who lands at number 1? 7 men. 7 completely different personalities. One host who's seen it all. This is a fact-grounded, observation-based ranking built from every documented interaction, every recorded interview, every unscripted moment caught on camera between Jimmy Fallon and BTS. Let's get into it. Number 7. The one who makes the room feel warmer, Jimin. There's a specific kind of person who walks into a room and doesn't demand attention, they simply receive it. Not because they're the loudest, not because they're performing, but because something about their presence makes everyone in the room relax. That's Jimin. And understanding why he lands at number 7 on this list, not lower, not higher, requires understanding exactly what kind of energy he brings, and why that energy, despite being genuinely compelling, gets slightly outpaced by the members above him when measured specifically through the lens of a talk show dynamic. Park Jimin was born on October 13, 1995, in Busan, South Korea. He grew up in a port city known for its directness, its seafront toughness, and its distinct regional accent. A detail that has followed Jimin throughout his career, and one that his bandmates have gently teased him about in dozens of documented interviews over the years. He trained at Big Hit Entertainment for roughly 2 years before debuting with BTS in June 2013, which makes him one of the shorter tenured trainees in the group at the time of debut. What he lacked in training years, he compensated for in physical discipline. His background in contemporary dance at Busan High School of Arts, where he was ranked first in his department, gave him a technical foundation that separated him from many of his peers before he ever set foot in a recording studio. By the time BTS began appearing on American television in earnest, Jimin had already established himself as the group's most emotionally expressive performer. His stage presence is built on a very specific kind of vulnerability, controlled, intentional, and deeply felt. Watch any of his performances from the Love Yourself or Map of the Soul era and the pattern is consistent. He pulls emotion out of a song not by overselling it, but by finding the exact physical gesture that communicates what the lyric is saying before the lyric even lands. That's a rare skill. Most performers learn it over decades. Jimin arrived with it essentially pre-installed. But here's where it gets interesting in the context of Jimmy Fallon specifically. Fallon's show operates on a particular kind of chemistry. It rewards spontaneity. It rewards humor, and above all, it rewards the guest who can match Fallon's energy without overshadowing him. Fallon is not a confrontational interviewer. He's collaborative. He builds with his guests rather than pushing against them. And Jimin, temperamentally, fits that model almost perfectly, which is both his strength and, in this specific ranking, a slight limitation. When BTS appeared on The Tonight Show for the iconic Rockefeller Plaza performance in February 2020, Fallon was visibly excited in a way that felt unscripted and genuine. The Plaza takeover, which involved multiple locations across New York City, including Grand Central Terminal, the subway, and the plaza itself, was one of the most elaborate performance segments in the show's recent history. Jimin's contribution across those sequences was precisely what you'd expect from him, technically flawless, emotionally present, and visually magnetic. But in the interview portions, he operated mostly in group mode, warm smiles, nodding engagement, the occasional phrase in English that landed cleanly without being elaborate. That's not a criticism. It's a calibration. Jimin's English has improved significantly over the years, and he's been open in multiple documented interviews about working on the language actively. But in the early Tonight Show appearances, language was a genuine barrier that slightly muted his natural personality in the interview chair. What comes through easily in Korean, the quick wit, the self-deprecating humor, the easy warmth required translation, and translation always loses something in live television timing. What never required translation, though, was his physical expressiveness. There's a widely circulated clip from backstage footage of one of BTS's Tonight Show appearances where Jimin is simply standing around, not performing, just existing, and he's still somehow interesting to watch. The way he holds himself, the micro-expressions, the way he interacts with the people around him. Fallon has spoken broadly about BTS having a presence that didn't need language to communicate, and watching Jimin specifically, you understand what that means in practice. His solo career adds additional context to why he belongs on this list at all. In March 2023, Jimin became the first South Korean solo artist to debut at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 with Like Crazy, the lead single from his debut album Face. That wasn't a group achievement. That was Jimin, individually, breaking through one of the most competitive charts in the music industry on his own terms. The album itself explored themes of escapism, identity, and emotional suppression, subjects Jimin has discussed openly in interviews, framing them not as abstract artistic choices, but as things he was genuinely working through during the pandemic period and its aftermath. That honesty, that willingness to discuss internal struggle without performing distress about it, is something Fallon's interview format tends to surface well. Fallon doesn't push guests toward darkness, but he creates enough safety that guests who want to go there can. Jimin, in that environment, tends to open in ways that are quietly compelling rather than dramatically revealing. His military service began in December 2023, when he enlisted in the Republic of Korea Army alongside fellow BTS member Jungkook. He completed his mandatory service and returned, like the rest of BTS, to a music industry that had spent roughly 2 years in a holding pattern waiting for the group to reassemble. The reunion chapter of BTS in 2025 and into 2026 reignited significant global attention, and Jimin came back with an artistic confidence that felt different, more settled, less anxious about proving anything. In the context of the updated Tonight Show interactions that followed BTS's post-military return, the dynamic shifted noticeably. Jimin's English had sharpened. His comfort in front of an American camera had deepened. And the quality that had always been there, that particular warmth that makes the room feel like it got slightly brighter when he walked in, had more room to operate because the language gap had narrowed. He still doesn't dominate an interview the way some of his bandmates do. He's not the one driving the conversation, not the one with the sharpest one-liner. But there's a case to be made, and fans make it constantly, that Jimin's interview presence is actually more realistic than the others. He's not playing a character. He's not leaning into a bit. He's just being himself, and that self happens to be someone with an unusually high capacity for genuine warmth in a context that usually produces performed warmth. Fallon, to his credit, has always responded to authenticity over performance. Which is exactly why Jimin, despite being at #7, is not someone Fallon would look at as a throwaway entry on a list. He's the member who, across every interaction, consistently left the impression of someone who actually wanted to be there, not for the camera, not for the audience, but for the conversation itself. That's a rarer quality than people give credit for. The reason he lands at 7 rather than higher is simply that the members above him bring something slightly more distinctive to the specific format of a Fallon interview, more comic timing, more linguistic agility, more moments that Fallon can visibly react to in real time. Jimin's strengths tend to land more on a slight delay. You watch the footage back and you notice things you didn't register in real time. That's genuinely valuable. But on live television, measured in the moment, real-time impact is what moves the needle. And the members who move that needle with more immediate force are all still ahead. #6, the one nobody can quite figure out, Taehyung v. Most celebrities, when you put them in front of a talk show host, are predictable within about 90 seconds. You can map the arc. They'll be charming, they'll be modest, they'll tell the approved story, they'll laugh at the right moment. It's not dishonest, it's just the grammar of the format. Everyone learns it eventually. Taehyung never did. And that single fact explains almost everything about why he's on this list and why, despite landing at number 6, he generates a disproportionate amount of the most memorable individual moments in any BTS group appearance. Kim Taehyung was born on December 30th, 1995, in Daegu, South Korea, a city in the southeastern inland of the country, culturally distinct from Seoul and Busan. Known for a certain directness and a regional identity that Taehyung has referenced in interviews as something he carries with pride. He grew up partly in the rural Gyeocheong County area, raised in significant part by his paternal grandparents, and that background, quieter, more agricultural, less urban, surfaces in unexpected ways throughout his artistic choices and his general relationship with the world. He has described his grandmother as one of the most formative figures in his life. In 2020, he posted openly about her passing on social media, and the grief was unperformed and plainly felt. That capacity for unguarded emotional honesty, whether in joy or loss, is one of the most consistent things about him across years of public documentation. He trained at Big Hit Entertainment and debuted with BTS in June 2013 under the stage name V, a name he chose himself to represent victory. Though he has noted in interviews that the meaning felt secondary to the sound and simplicity of the letter. His role in the group is as vocalist, a designation that somewhat undersells what he actually does sonically. His voice sits in a natural baritone range that is genuinely unusual in Korean pop, where the genre historically skewed toward higher, lighter tonal registers. That voice, particularly its lower depth, became one of BTS's most distinctive sonic textures across albums like HYYH, Love Yourself, Tear, and Map of the Soul. 7. But voice is actually the least interesting thing about Taehyung in the context of a Jimmy Fallon appearance. What makes him specifically compelling in that format is something harder to categorize. Fans have used the term 4D personality for years, a loose, affectionate label for someone who operates on a frequency slightly outside the social standard. It sounds like a compliment with an asterisk, but in practice it means something very specific. Taehyung's responses to situations are genuinely unpredictable. Not in a chaotic way, not in a way that reads as instability, but in the way that a person who has genuinely never prioritized conformity responds to stimuli in real time. He notices things other people in the room have already mentally filed past. He responds to things that most people would consider unremarkable with visible delight. He expresses things that most people keep internal. In interview contexts, particularly the Tonight Show appearances, this quality produced some of the most distinctly shareable individual moments across all 7 members. There's documented footage of Taehyung, mid-interview, spontaneously reaching out and adjusting something about his own appearance or the set around him, not for any particular reason, just because something caught his attention. There's the way his expressions shift in real time with zero filter, genuine boredom, genuine fascination, genuine surprise, all visible on his face before his social brain apparently registers that cameras are pointed at him. For a television host whose entire format is built on authentic human reactions, that quality is extraordinarily useful. That's what Taehyung does consistently in interview spaces. His artistic interests layer additional dimension onto this. He has been openly and extensively documented as a serious lover of art, particularly Western classical painting, vintage photography, and jazz. He visited multiple museums during BTS's international tour dates, including extended visits to the Louvre in Paris and various galleries in New York, and posted about those visits with the detailed enthusiasm of someone who had done preparatory research rather than treating it as a tourist checkbox. He plays saxophone, not as a party trick, but as a sustained practice, and has cited musicians like Miles Davis and Chet Baker as genuine reference points rather than name drops. His debut solo album Layover, released in September 2023, was built almost entirely on this aesthetic, jazz-inflected, warm, unhurried, and explicitly uncommercial in a way that was notable given the commercial weight his name carries. Layover debuted at #1 in multiple countries and charted respectably in the United States, despite being exactly the kind of album that algorithm-driven industry logic would never have greenlit for a solo debut. That's not a small fact. It says something about the depth of trust his audience extends to him, and it says something about Taehyung that he used his first solo platform not to chase the biggest number, but to make something he actually wanted to make. His fashion sense also warrants documentation because it connects directly to the impression he makes in American television appearances. Taehyung has been cited by multiple fashion publications and industry figures as having one of the most distinctive personal styles among contemporary entertainers. He served as a global ambassador for Celine beginning in 2022 and quickly became one of the brand's most high-profile faces in Asia. His relationship with fashion, like his relationship with music and visual art, is characterized by genuine knowledge rather than brand placement compliance. He discusses garments, designers, and eras with specificity. He has been photographed in vintage pieces that required active hunting rather than stylist delivery. He wears things that most people in his position would consider too risky, and they generally work. In a Fallon appearance, this translates to presence. Taehyung walks out and the visual impression is immediate and specific, not just well-dressed, but distinctly so. That visual particularity signals something to an audience before he says a single word, and it primes them to pay attention differently than they might for a more conventionally styled guest. His military service ran in parallel with Jimin's. He enlisted in the Republic of Korea Army's Special Division in December 2023, completing his mandatory service before returning in 2025 alongside the rest of BTS. The post-service period brought noticeable shifts in his public presentation. He seemed, by multiple accounts across documented interviews and public appearances, more settled, more willing to sit with silence, less concerned with calibrating his reactions for external consumption, which, given that his baseline was already low on that particular concern, produced an interview subject who had gotten genuinely more interesting with time. The reason he sits at #6 rather than higher is the same reason he's fascinating in the first place. His unpredictability, while consistently entertaining, doesn't always translate into the kind of sustained conversational momentum that moves a talk show interview forward. He produces extraordinary individual moments. Moments that get clipped, captioned, shared, and replayed. But the through line of a conversation, the building of a back and forth that has cumulative energy, is something the members above him tend to handle more reliably. What Taehyung gives you instead is the single best clip of the night. And on any given evening, that might actually be the more valuable contribution. #5, the one who grew up in front of the camera, Jungkook. There is a specific kind of person whose story works on two levels simultaneously, what they are right now and what they were before, where the gap between those 2 points is wide enough that just describing both of them, without editorializing, creates its own momentum. Jungkook is that person. And in the context of a Jimmy Fallon appearance, that dual narrative functions like a second personality in the room, the person talking to you, and the ghost of who that person used to be, both visible at once, both making the conversation richer without either of them trying. Jungkook was born on September 1st, 1997, in Busan, South Korea, the same city as Jimin, a coincidence that fans have documented extensively and the two of them have discussed in multiple interviews, typically with the easy affection of people who've known each other long enough that the origin story feels like shared mythology rather than biography. He was 13 years old when he auditioned for Big Hit Entertainment. 13. At that audition, he was already being pursued by multiple other. He spent 2 years training before debuting with BTS in June 2013 at 15 years old, making him the group's youngest member, the maknae, in Korean group terminology, a role that carries specific social weight in Korean culture, where age hierarchies are formal and observed rather than approximate and casual. The maknae is protected, teased, indulged, and expected to show deference. Jungkook operated inside that structure with what appeared to be genuine comfort, and the older members, particularly Jin, J-Hope, and RM, have documented in multiple interviews over the years the particular experience of watching him grow from a quiet, slightly overwhelmed teenager into the performer he became. That growth is the core of the Jungkook story, and it's what gives him his specific gravity in an interview setting. Watch the earliest BTS appearances on American television, and then watch the most recent ones. The contrast in Jungkook, specifically, is among the most dramatic of any member. In 2019 and 2020, he was present, professional, technically excellent on stage, but in interview chairs, particularly when English was being used, he was notably reserved. Responsive rather than initiating. Careful rather than confident. The body language of someone who knows exactly how much he doesn't yet know and has decided that precision is safer than reach. By 2023, that had changed substantially. The post-Butter and Proof era produced a version of Jungkook who seemed to have made a specific decision about how to occupy space in a room, fully, on his own terms, without the careful self-monitoring of earlier years. His English had improved meaningfully. He'd spent years doing solo content, including cooking live streams, gaming sessions, and documentary-style vlogs that had collectively accumulated hundreds of millions of views. And the cumulative effect of being watched that closely, that regularly, by that many people had apparently done something to his relationship with visibility. It normalized it in a way that formal training never quite manages. His solo career added hard data to what had previously been an impression. In July 2023, his collaboration with American rapper Latto debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making Jungkook the first Korean solo artist to achieve that specific milestone. He followed it with 3D, a collaboration with Jack Harlow, and then with the full debut solo album Golden in November 2023, which topped charts in multiple countries and performed strongly in the United States. The numbers across that run were not quiet successes. They were statements about the scale of individual recognition he'd achieved entirely outside the BTS group context. That distinction matters in a Fallon interview specifically because it changes the conversation's center of gravity. Fallon has hosted solo acts and group members his entire career. When someone in a group has achieved demonstrable solo recognition at that level, the interview dynamic shifts. The host has more individual story to pull from, more specific moments to reference, more genuine curiosity to express about the person rather than the collective. And Jungkook, by 2023 and into the 2025-2026 post-military return period, had accumulated enough solo story to fill an interview on his own terms. The Golden Magne label, a nickname that BTS's fanbase and eventually much of Korean popular culture attached to him based on his apparent facility with virtually any skill he attempted, is documented across enough real instances to qualify as something more than fan hyperbole. He has been filmed demonstrating competence in freestyle dance, boxing, archery, swimming, taekwondo, and several other physical disciplines at levels that consistently surprised people observing for the first time. His vocal range is among the widest in BTS, covering both the emotional tenderness required for ballads and the technical precision required for complex melodic runs in faster material. He learned to skateboard, visibly, in real time, on camera, and then got good at it faster than most people who've been doing it for years. In a Fallon format, this kind of generalist excellence is gold. Fallon's show runs segments, games, challenges, physical competitions that require exactly this. A guest who can be game for anything and who turns out to be unexpectedly capable at whatever they try. Jungkook is that guest at a level that few entertainers match, and the documented evidence of Fallon's genuine delight at athletic or skill-based segments with BTS connects naturally to Jungkook's specific profile. His tattoos added another layer to the public conversation around him, particularly in South Korea where visible tattoos carry more social weight than in most Western contexts, and where the decision to display them prominently across his right hand and arm was a quiet form of self-declaration. He has not made elaborate statements about the decision. He simply made it and moved on, which is its own kind of statement. His military service served alongside Jimin in the Republic of Korea Army's Special Division beginning in December 2023, concluded in 2025. The BTS reunion that followed was documented extensively across global media, and Jungkook's return to performing was characterized by a visible physical and presence-based maturity that observers noted consistently across interviews and stage appearances. Military service in South Korea produces a specific shift in young men that is cultural and structural rather than anecdotal. 2 years inside a highly regimented institutional environment changes the relationship with authority, with discipline, and with time. Jungkook came back out of it looking like someone who'd found an additional floor beneath the confidence he'd already built. In the specific frame of a Jimmy Fallon ranking, Jungkook sits at number 5 for a reason that is precise rather than vague. He is extraordinary. His resume at 28 years old is objectively remarkable. His on-camera presence is polished and genuine, and his individual story. The shy teenager who turned down multiple agencies at 13 to become one of the most recognized solo artists in the world is the kind of narrative that writes itself in an interview setting. But the members above him bring something slightly more immediately unpredictable, slightly more tonally distinct, slightly more specific to the shape of what Fallon's show actually rewards in conversation. Jungkook is the kind of guest who makes everything work. The members ahead of him are the kind who make things unexpected. And unexpected, in this format, tends to win. Number 4, the one who figured out exactly what he is, Jin. Confidence is one of the most misread qualities in public life. People confuse it with arrogance, with performance, with the practiced ease of someone who's been told they're great so many times that they've simply accepted it as ambient fact. Real confidence, the structural kind, the kind that doesn't require external calibration, looks different. It's quieter in some ways, louder in others, and it almost always has a specific origin story. Jin's origin story is one of the stranger ones in modern pop history, and it explains nearly everything about why he behaves the way he does on a stage, in an interview chair, and specifically in the kind of loose, humor-forward environment that Jimmy Fallon has built his career around. Kim Seok-jin was born on December 4, 1992, in Gwacheon, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, making him the oldest member of BTS by a gap that, in Korean social hierarchy, is not informal or casual. The eldest in a Korean group carries specific responsibilities, specific forms of address, and a specific social position that the younger members are expected to acknowledge explicitly. Jin occupied that position for 12-plus years of BTS's documented history, and anyone who has watched enough BTS content to develop an opinion about it will recognize the way that seniority operates in their internal dynamics. Warmly, mostly, but with real structure underneath. He was not discovered through a formal audition process. He was street cast. A Big Hit Entertainment staff member spotted him getting off a bus while he was wearing his school uniform. Multiple Korean entertainment accounts and Jin himself in documented interviews have confirmed this version of the story and approached him with an invitation to audition. Jin's initial instinct, by his own account, was skepticism. He had no particular ambition toward the entertainment industry at the time. He was studying acting and enrolled at Konkuk University pursuing film, a path that made linear sense given his interests and family background. His father was the CEO of a food company, a detail that adds context to the ease with which Jin has always moved through the world, not wealthy in a distant way, but not someone whose baseline was scarcity or pressure. He eventually auditioned, was accepted into Big Hit, and debuted with BTS in June 2013. His training period was shorter than most of his bandmates, and this fact has been referenced in interviews, including by Jin himself with characteristic bluntness, as something he was acutely aware of in the early years. He knew he was catching up. He also knew, apparently fairly early, that the area where he would not be catching up but instead operating from a position of natural advantage was the specific combination of physical appearance and comic instinct that became his most publicly recognizable qualities. The worldwide handsome declaration happened at the 2018 Billboard Music Awards, where BTS appeared as the first K-pop act to win a Billboard award and present at the ceremony. When Jimin stepped to the microphone and said it clearly, without apparent irony, to an arena full of American music industry professionals and a television audience, it produced a reaction that cut across cultural lines instantly. It was funny. It was self-aware. It was also, in a way that landed only in retrospect, completely true. Jimin is, by any objective measure, among the more strikingly handsome entertainers working in any market. The joke worked because it walked the precise line between vanity and self-deprecation. He wasn't being modest, but the framing itself was the punchline. That's a difficult thing to engineer in a scripted context. Pulling it off unscripted, at a major American awards ceremony, in your second language, is something else entirely. That event is probably the single moment most responsible for Jin's reputation in American media, and it is absolutely the lens through which Jimmy Fallon, who has referenced BTS's BBMAs appearances and American crossover moments across multiple interview segments, would process Jin's specific brand of charisma. Because Jin's humor is not incidental. It is structural. It is the primary mode through which he relates to the world in public, and it is consistent in a way that distinguishes it from performance. His dad joke style, sometimes called ajiasi jokes in Korean, a reference to the middle-aged man who tells terrible puns without shame, has been documented across years of BTS content. The jokes are frequently groan-worthy. They are also frequently delivered with a timing and a commitment that elevates them beyond their material. Jimin doesn't hedge. He tells the joke, watches it land, and then laughs his own laugh, the one that sounds like a windshield wiper and has been described across thousands of documented fan accounts as simultaneously ridiculous and completely genuine. And somehow that reaction makes the room laugh harder than the joke itself did. This laugh is not a brand asset that was cultivated. It is the actual sound Jimin makes when something strikes him as funny, captured on enough different cameras across enough different years that its authenticity is not in question. It's also, in the specific context of a Fallon segment, exactly the kind of thing that sets a room alight. Fallon's show lives on genuine physical reactions. The unexpected laugh, the involuntary snort, the moment where the host or guest loses composure in a way that can't be scripted. Jin's laugh is that moment waiting to happen every time he's in the room. His solo music adds a dimension that is often underweight in conversations about his public persona. The Astronaut, his 2022 solo single, was co-written with Coldplay, a collaboration that came out of BTS's connection with the band and Chris Martin specifically, and resulted in a song that Jimin performed at Coldplay's concert in Buenos Aires in front of approximately 60,000 people. It was his solo debut performance, and he did it in Argentina, in a Coldplay set, weeks before entering mandatory military service. The song itself is not a joke or a comedy vehicle. It's genuinely affecting, a meditation on leaving something you love and trusting that the foundation you built is strong enough to survive your absence. Given the context of his imminent enlistment, it carried weight that went beyond its lyrical content. Jimin was the first BTS member to enlist in the Republic of Korea Army, beginning his mandatory service in December 2022. Ahead of the other members due to his age and an adjustment in Korean military exemption policy that had previously allowed top cultural figures to defer service. He completed his service and was discharged in June 2024, returning before any of his bandmates. That return was documented extensively, including footage of BTS members greeting him at his discharge that circulated across social media and mainstream press simultaneously. What the military period did to Jin's public presence is subtle but visible. He came back with the same humor intact, the same instinct to defuse, to entertain, to occupy a room through comic timing rather than gravitas, but with something slightly more settled underneath it. Less need to fill silence. More comfort with the laugh landing on its own terms without additional scaffolding. In a Jimmy Fallon segment, Jimin is the dream guest for a specific reason. He is genuinely, documentably funny without requiring the host to do the work. Fallon's greatest challenge in an interview is manufacturing comedy from guests who are talented, but not naturally funny in real-time conversation. Jimin removes that challenge entirely. He arrives with the material preloaded, delivers it without prompting, and then responds to Fallon's reaction in a way that extends the bit rather than closing it. That's a professional-level comic skill. It lives in Jin's body the way dance lives in Jimin's, not as something he learned, but as something he simply is. He sits at number 4 rather than higher because the members above him bring that same energy with slightly more conversational range, humor plus something else, a second gear that Jin, at his most comfortable, sometimes doesn't feel the need to shift into. But if all you wanted was the best joke of the night, there's a very strong case that Jin is your man. Number 3, the one who makes the building feel different, J-Hope. There is a version of energy that is performed and a version that is structural. The performed kind is recognizable because it has edges, moments where it visibly costs something, where the person producing it needs a beat to recharge, where the gap between the face they're showing and what's actually running underneath becomes briefly visible if you know where to look. Structural energy is different. It doesn't have those edges. It doesn't require management because it isn't separate from the person, it simply is the person, operating at full capacity, which happens to be a capacity that most people around them cannot match without significant effort. Young Hoseok runs on structural energy. And that single fact, more than any individual achievement or documented interview moment, is the most accurate explanation of why he sits at number 3 on this list and why Jimmy Fallon has never once appeared anything other than genuinely energized in his presence. Young Hoseok was born on February 18, 1994, in Gwangju, South Korea, the capital of South Jeolla Province and a city with a specific, significant place in Korean modern history. Gwangju was the site of the May 18th Democratic Uprising in 1980, a pro-democracy movement that was violently suppressed by the military government and that remains one of the most important events in South Korean political memory. J-Hope has not leaned on this as biography in interviews, but context matters. He comes from a place that has a deeply embedded cultural relationship with resistance, with community solidarity, and with the idea that what a group does together carries more weight than what any individual does alone. Whether that connects directly to his documented investment in collective energy and group dynamics is speculation. But it is not irrelevant. He began dancing as a child and by his mid-teens was an active member of a Gwangju-based street dance crew called Neuron, competing in regional competitions. This background is not anecdotal, it is the documented foundation of a technical skill set that has been assessed by professional choreographers, peer dancers, and industry figures consistently and without significant dissent as among the best in Korean popular music. He was not a trainee who learned dance as part of a packaged skill set. He arrived as a dancer who then learned everything else that BTS required. He was recruited to Big Hit Entertainment around 2010 and debuted with BTS in 2013. What is less frequently noted in mainstream coverage but is documented in multiple Korean entertainment sources and referenced by J-Hope himself in interviews is that he was at one point among the most homesick trainees in the Big Hit dorms. That in the early period of training, before the group solidified its internal bonds, he seriously considered leaving to return to Gwangju. The fact that he stayed, for reasons he has described in terms of both personal resolve and the relationships he was building with the other members, is one of those small turning points whose downstream consequences are enormous. The J-Hope who almost went home to Gwangju is a different person than the J-Hope who became BTS's hype engine, its emotional thermostat, and arguably its most important internal infrastructure piece. His role in BTS is officially listed as main dancer and rapper. This is accurate as far as it goes and completely inadequate as a description of what he actually does. The internal function he serves, acknowledged by multiple members across dozens of documented interviews, is closer to emotional regulation. When group energy drops, J-Hope's presence pulls it back up. When nerves are high before a performance, his behavior in the backstage footage is consistently the same, moving, talking, generating sound and light, not performing positivity for the camera, but actually being the thing that makes the atmosphere shift. Other members have described this quality in Korean terms that translate roughly to the idea of someone who makes the air in a room better. That's not a metaphor the members use loosely. In the Jimmy Fallon context, This quality is the most immediately valuable thing in the building. Fallon's show is, at its core, an energy management enterprise. He has to sustain a particular atmosphere across multiple segments, multiple guests, a live audience, and a broadcast that runs on momentum. Guests who sustain or amplify that momentum are worth more to the format than guests who are interesting but atmospheric, whose value builds slowly. J-Hope is the rare guest who walks in having already done half of Fallon's job for him. The dance-based segments that The Tonight Show has run with BTS have consistently produced some of the highest engagement content in the show's recent digital history, and J-Hope's contribution to those segments is not merely performative. He is technically the most complete dancer in the group, and when a camera finds him in a performance context, even informally, even in a segment that wasn't designed to showcase individual members, there is a clarity and a distinctiveness to his movement that separates him visually from everyone else in the frame. Choreographers describe this quality as hit, the ability to make the accent of a movement land with such precision that it registers differently in the body of the viewer. J-Hope's hit is among the strongest documented in Korean popular music, and it is visible even in contexts where he isn't trying to showcase it. His solo career made history in a way that is specific and verifiable. In July 2022, he headlined the main stage at Lollapalooza in Chicago, a set that was documented extensively, reviewed widely, and officially recognized as the first time a Korean solo artist headlined a major American music festival. That's not a chart position. That's a physical, documented event. 60-something thousand people in Grant Park, Chicago, watching J-Hope close out the main stage on a Friday night. The performance ran for approximately an hour and included a set list that moved through multiple genres, multiple energy registers, and multiple costume changes while maintaining the through line of someone who had been building toward this specific kind of moment since they were a teenager dancing in Gwangju. His solo album Jack in the Box, released in July 2022 as a precursor to the Lollapalooza appearance, was a deliberate departure from his established public persona. It was dark in tone, dense in production, and explicitly addressed the anxiety of expectation, the weight of being the person everyone expects to be joyful. That decision to use a solo platform to interrogate rather than confirm the public image is the same decision Jimin made with Face and Taehyung made with Layover, and it reflects something consistent across BTS's solo projects. A collective determination not to let public perception calcify into the only version of themselves they're allowed to express. His military service began in April 2023. He was the first of the post-2022 enlistments, enlisting voluntarily ahead of when his call-up would have been mandatory. He was discharged in October 2024 and returned to a music landscape that had been watching Hope on the street. A documentary series released during his service that revisited his origins as a street dancer and explored his relationship with the art form outside the BTS context. The documentary was produced and released while he was actively serving, meaning it reached audiences without him being available to support or respond to it publicly. It became one of the most viewed pieces of BTS-adjacent content during the service period, which says something about the depth of audience investment in his specific story. He sits at number 3 because two members above him bring something that J-Hope's format of energy, despite its extraordinary consistency and power, slightly edges around, the ability to change registers. J-Hope operates at a high pitch and sustains it. The members above him can shift from sharp to quiet, from serious to... But if you needed a single guest to make Jimmy Fallon's entire production staff feel like they were doing the best work of their careers, just by walking through the door, the answer is probably J-Hope. And it probably isn't close. Number 2, the one who changes what a conversation can be, RM. There is a type of intelligence that is useful in a meeting room, and there is a type that is useful in front of a camera, and these two types overlap less than people assume. The meeting room variety is comfortable with density, with abstraction, with the kind of thinking that requires a sustained attention span and a willingness to sit inside complexity without resolving it prematurely. Camera intelligence is faster, lighter, more reactive. It privileges the sharp response over the accurate one, the memorable phrasing over the complete thought. The rarest version of public intelligence is the person who carries both simultaneously, who can think at depth in real time and still translate that depth into something a camera can hold. Kim Namjoon does this, consistently, across a documented body of interviews that stretches over a decade and includes some of the most consequential stages on which a working musician has ever been asked to speak. It is why he is number 2. It is also, if you're being honest about it, why the argument for him being number 1 is not unreasonable. Kim Namjoon was born on September 12, 1994, in Ilsan, a planned city in Goyang, Gyeonggi Province, effectively a satellite city of Seoul, close enough to the capital to feel its gravity without being inside it. He was academically exceptional from an early age, scoring in the top percentile ranges on standardized assessments and demonstrating the kind of verbal and analytical capability that in a different biographical direction would have produced a career in academia, law, or policy. He has referenced this alternative path in interviews with a tone that suggests genuine curiosity about what it might have looked like, not regret that it didn't happen, a subtle distinction that tells you something about his relationship with the choices he made. His path into music came not through a company's talent search, but through an underground rap scene. He was writing and performing rap in his early teens, developing a reputation in Seoul's indie hip-hop community that caught the attention of Big Hit Entertainment. He was the first member signed to the label, recruited specifically on the basis of that existing work, which meant he arrived at Big Hit not as raw material to be shaped, but as someone with already formed artistic instincts that the label had to accommodate rather than install. That's a meaningfully different starting position from most of his bandmates, and it produced a meaningfully different relationship to BTS's creative process. RM's fingerprints are on the group's artistic direction at a level that is documented in production credits, songwriting credits, and in the accounts of collaborators and label figures across multiple years. He taught himself English. This is the fact that gets cited most frequently in profiles of him, and it is worth examining precisely rather than celebrating loosely. The primary vehicle was the American sitcom Friends, which he has mentioned in multiple interviews as the show he watched in repetition until the language became internalized rather than translated. This is a legitimate and well-documented language acquisition method, immersive repetition with contextual grounding, but it produces a very specific variety of English proficiency, conversational, naturally cadenced, comfortable with idiomatic expression, and equipped with the tonal flexibility that comes from learning a language through performance rather than textbooks. RM's English, as a result, the UN General Assembly speech in September 2018 is the moment that most clearly documents what RM does when given a serious platform. He has returned to the UN and to similar high-level platforms multiple times since, including an address at the White House in 2022 alongside other BTS members to discuss anti-Asian hate crimes, a meeting documented across multiple credible news sources that resulted in formal policy commitments from the Biden administration. These are not ceremonial appearances. They are documented interactions with governmental infrastructure that produced real outcomes, and RM was the primary verbal spokesperson in each of them. In the Jimmy Fallon format, this background operates on 2 levels. First, it makes him the most reliable interview subject in the group from a pure logistics standpoint. He can handle any question, pivot gracefully from any topic, manage any unexpected direction in the conversation without visible discomfort. Fallon, who has interviewed heads of state and Nobel laureates alongside pop stars and comedians, responds to that kind of conversational range with a specific quality of engagement that is different from his default warmth. It's more active, more curious. The interview becomes a conversation between 2 people who are both genuinely interested in where it goes rather than a host managing a guest through a pre-planned sequence of talking points. Second, RM's presence in an American television context carries a particular kind of cultural weight that is distinct from the rest of BTS. He is the person who has most consistently been the face of BTS's engagement with American institutions, not because he was assigned that role, but because his English proficiency and his intellectual facility made him the natural point of contact whenever BTS interfaced with American media, government, or cultural infrastructure. Fallon knows this. American audiences know this. When RM sits in the interview chair, there is a specific expectation, not of entertainment, but of something more like understanding. And he delivers it without sacrificing the warmth and humor that keep the conversation accessible. His solo work adds dimension that is increasingly personal and increasingly removed from the BTS context as a creative frame. His 2022 album Indigo, which he described as a record he needed to make before turning 30, featured collaborations with Erykah Badu, Anderson .Paak, Mahalia, and others. A roster that reflected his genuine musical reference points rather than a strategic attempt at Western market positioning. His 2024 album Right Place, Wrong Person was critically received as his most cohesive solo statement, exploring themes of displacement, identity, and the particular experience of being someone who is recognized everywhere and fully known almost nowhere. His love of visual art is documented and specific. He has visited major museums on every continent he has performed on, maintained a personal art collection, written about individual works with the specificity of someone who has done sustained reading in art history, and has been recognized by art world figures as a collector with genuine taste rather than a celebrity with an acquisitions budget. He has used his platform to draw public attention to specific Korean contemporary artists, with documented effects on those artists' visibility and market positioning. He enlisted for mandatory military service in December 2023 and returned in 2025, having apparently done substantial reading, writing, and internal processing during the service period. Post-military interviews and public appearances reflected a RM who had found some resolution, or at least some peace, with the tension between public identity and private self that his solo music had been working through for years. He sits at number 2 rather than number 1 for a reason that is subtle but real. RM's mode is fundamentally serious, generously, warmly, humorously serious, but serious at its core. The number 1 member brings something that RM, in his intellectual fullness, occasionally doesn't bother with: genuine surprise. The quality of making even someone who has been doing this as long as Fallon has look at another person and think, I genuinely did not see that coming. RM is the best interview. But the best interview and the most surprising person in the room are not always the same thing. Number 1 is the most surprising person in the room. Number 1, the one nobody saw coming, Suga. Every great talk show has a moment, usually one per season if the host is lucky, where a guest does something so completely contrary to expectation that the host's entire professional framework briefly short-circuits. Not because the guest was outrageous or controversial, but because they were precisely themselves at a moment when nobody in the room was prepared for what precisely themselves looked like. These moments are not manufactured. They cannot be scheduled. They happen when the person in the chair has zero investment in managing the impression they're making, and when that person turns out to be significantly more layered than the label attached to them suggested. Fallon has had versions of this moment with many guests across a long career. The BTS member most likely to produce it, and who, across documented appearances, has produced it most reliably, is the one who looks, on paper, like the least probable choice for number 1 on any list measuring talk show magnetism. That is Min Youngie, Suga. And the story of how he became the most compelling member of BTS in a Fallon context is essentially the story of what happens when a person who has never been particularly interested in being liked turns out to be extraordinarily, irresistibly interesting. Min Youngie was born on March 9, 1993, in Daegu, South Korea, the same city as Taehyung. Though the two of them grew up in different circumstances and have described their shared origin with the amusement of people who find the coincidence more funny than meaningful. Daegu is South Korea's third largest city, known for its summer heat, its textile industry history, and a regional cultural character that is often described as direct to the point of bluntness. That character is not absent from Youngie. It is foundational. He began making music as a middle schooler, drawn specifically to hip-hop and the underground rap scene that was developing in major Korean cities in the late 2000s. By his early teens, he was performing in Daegu's underground circuit under the name Gloss, writing his own material, studying production, and operating entirely outside any industry structure. This is not a detail that gets romanticized the right way in most profiles. Underground rap in a mid-sized South Korean city in 2007 and 2008 was not a path. It was a choice that had no guaranteed destination and significant social cost. His family's support for this direction was, by his own account in multiple documented interviews, not enthusiastic. His parents wanted a more conventional trajectory. He chose the music anyway. To fund his involvement in music and his basic living expenses as a teenager, he worked part-time jobs. One of those jobs was food delivery. During that period, he was involved in a vehicle accident that damaged his shoulder, an injury that required surgery, that affected his physical capability for years. And that became relevant again in 2023 when it influenced his decision regarding the form of his mandatory military service. He has referenced this period of his life in interviews and in his music with a specificity that distinguishes it from vague biographical backstory. He remembers it precisely because it was formative in a way that comfort never is. He was discovered by Big Hit Entertainment and debuted with BTS in June 2013 at 20 years old, older than several of his bandmates, a detail that shaped his position in the group's social dynamics. He was a young and older brother figure to Jimin, Taehyung, Jungkook, and close in age to J-Hope and Jin. Within BTS's documented internal culture, Youngie occupies a specific space, the member most likely to say the true thing when everyone else is considering the diplomatic thing. Other members have described him with a mix of affection and mild wariness that is the precise emotional cocktail produced by someone who will, gently and without malice, tell you exactly what they observe. His solo work under the name August D is where the full depth of his artistic identity becomes visible, and where the disconnect between his public persona and his actual interior life becomes most dramatic. The 2016 mixtape August D, released for free, with zero commercial framework, contained direct, detailed, first-person accounts of depression, social phobia, and OCD. He has confirmed a diagnosis of OCD in multiple documented interviews and spoken about his experience with depression with the specificity of someone who has spent real time understanding what was happening to them rather than approximating it with general language. These were not the standard celebrity disclosure. They were clinical in their accuracy and personal in their framing. This mixtape arrived before the global conversation about mental health had reached its current visibility. In the South Korean context, where stigma around mental illness remains more entrenched than in many Western markets, the disclosure carried significant cultural weight. Mental health professionals and advocacy organizations in South Korea cited the mixtape's reach as a contributing factor in shifting conversation, particularly among young people, around the normalcy of psychological struggle and the value of naming it specifically. The downstream effects of a piece of music are difficult to measure, but the documentation of this one's impact on public discourse is substantial enough to treat as real. His production work inside BTS is extensive and credits verified. He has writing and production credits on a significant portion of BTS's discography, not as a frontline visible credit in Western media coverage, which tends to focus on the group's label and external collaborators, but in the actual filing records of songs across multiple albums. He has also produced for other artists, contributed to soundtracks, and built a discography as a behind-the-scenes architect that exists largely invisibly to audiences who engage with BTS primarily through its public-facing output. His solo world tour as August D in 2023 was his most significant individual statement as a live performer. The tour covered North America, Europe, Asia, and Oceania, selling out venues including the Forum in Los Angeles. His final album under the August D name, D-Day, was released in April 2023, the concluding chapter of a 7-year solo project that began with the raw self-disclosure of the 2016 mixtape and ended with something closer to integration, to the sound of someone who had worked through enough that they could close a chapter without forcing a resolution they hadn't actually found. His military service took a form that was publicly noted and briefly debated in Korean media. Due to his shoulder injury, the one from the delivery job accident decades prior, he was assigned to social service work rather than active duty, completing his mandatory obligation beginning September 2023 and being discharged in June 2024. He returned before most of his bandmates, and the post-service period brought a version of Youngie who appeared, across documented appearances, slightly more willing to take up space in a conversation than the pre-service version had been. Now, the Jimmy Fallon context. Why number 1? Because Suga, the image, the brand, the public-facing construct, is quiet, cool, slightly remote. That is the established expectation. The deadpan. The member who sits in the interview chair with the energy of someone who is observing a social ritual they find mildly amusing. And then he opens his mouth and what comes out is so precisely, unexpectedly, specifically funny, or unexpectedly tender, or unexpectedly direct, that the room recalibrates in real time. Fallon has a specific visible tell when a guest surprises him. His head goes back slightly before the laugh arrives. It is a half-second of genuine recalibration, the laugh that wasn't ready, that arrives before the professional persona could prepare it. Suga produces that reaction with a consistency that no other BTS member quite matches, because no other BTS member so thoroughly defies what the room expects before they've said a single word. The gap between the image and the reality is the source of all the best television. And in Suga's case, that gap is wide, documented, and reliably productive in exactly the format Jimmy Fallon has built his career around. He is number 1 because he is the member who makes the host forget he's working. That is the highest thing this list can say about anyone. 7 men. 7 completely different relationships with visibility, with language, with humor, with depth. One host who has spent decades learning how to read people in the 20 seconds before the cameras start rolling. What this ranking actually measures is not talent. All 7 members of BTS have documented, verifiable, extraordinary talent across multiple disciplines. It is not popularity. The chart positions and streaming numbers across all 7 are large enough to make that a useless variable. What it measures is something more specific, the quality of presence that a live talk show format rewards. The kind that produces real reactions rather than professional ones. Jimin, at number 7, brings warmth that is structural rather than performed, the member who makes the room feel like a safer place, whose emotional authenticity registers even when language barriers narrow the channel through which it travels. His like-crazy number 1 and his post-military artistic maturity made him a more complete interview subject over time. But his strengths land on a slight delay, and live television runs on real-time impact. Taehyung, at number 6, is the walking disproof of the idea that charisma is something you can plan. His 4D spontaneity, his genuine artistic intelligence across music, fashion, and visual art, and the specific unpredictability that makes the camera find him in a crowded frame, these produce the single best clip of any given night. His layover and his Celine ambassadorship added layers to a public image that was already unusually textured. He generates extraordinary individual moments. The through line of a sustained conversation is something the members above him handle more consistently. Jungkook, at number 5, is the living argument that a long enough timeline collapses the distance between potential and achievement. The 13-year-old who turned down agencies to sign with Big Hit became the first Korean solo artist to debut at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 with 7. The shy teenager who sat carefully in early interview chairs became someone who fills a room with ease on his own terms. His golden album and his post-military return confirmed a performer who had found his floor and was building upward from it. He makes everything work. The members above him make things unexpected. Jimin, at number 4, is the rarest kind of funny, genuinely, structurally, documentably funny in a live context without requiring the host to do the scaffolding. The worldwide handsome declaration at the 2018 BBMAs was not scripted confidence. It was real confidence wearing a joke as its vehicle. His The Astronaut with Coldplay performed live in Buenos Aires before 60,000 people weeks before his military enlistment showed the range behind the humor. He was the first to serve and the first to return, and he came back with the same instincts intact and slightly more comfort, letting them operate without supervision. He is the best joke of the night every night. J-Hope at number 3 is structural energy made human. His Lollapalooza 2022 headline set the first Korean solo artist to headline a major American music festival was not a statement about Korean pop crossing over. It was a statement about one specific person's capacity to command a stage that holds 60,000 people. His Jack in the Box interrogated the persona he had built. His Hope on the Street documentary revisited the street dancer in Gwangju who chose not to go home. He makes Jimmy Fallon's entire production staff feel like they're doing the best work of their careers by walking through the door. That is not a small thing. RM at number 2 is the most complete interview subject in the group and one of the most complete in contemporary popular music. He learned English through friends and went on to speak at the United Nations General Assembly. He produces music that collaborates with Erykah Badu and Anderson .Paak and gets critically acknowledged for it. He visits museums on 6 continents and writes about individual works with the specificity of someone who has done the reading. He is the best conversation Fallon will have this season. The distinction between him and number 1 is the difference between the best interview and the most surprising person in the room. Those are not always the same person. And Suga at number 1 is the most surprising person in the room. The Daegu underground rapper who worked food delivery to fund his music and damaged his shoulder in an accident that followed him for 2 decades. The person who disclosed depression and OCD on a 2016 free mixtape before the conversation was ready for it. The quietest physical presence in BTS who produces the loudest individual reactions in a live interview format because the gap between what the room expects and what actually arrives is wider and more reliably productive than any other member manages. He makes the host forget he's working. That is what number 1 means on this list. Every member of BTS has given Jimmy Fallon something real across years of documented interaction. 7 different gifts. 7 different kinds of presents. One group that, collectively, has produced some of the most genuinely electric moments in the show's modern history. The ranking is an argument. The argument is built on verifiable facts. And the most verifiable fact of all is this: no 7-member group in the modern era has walked into a talk show and made the host's job look this easy, from 7 completely different directions, simultaneously. That's not luck. That's 20+ years of combined work, arriving in the same room at the same time. Thanks for watching. If you have a different number 1, tell us in the comments. ARMY never misses. See you at ARMY.